The apple on the deed was small, brown, and hard as a walnut. Edmund Vane had set it there himself, in front of the solicitor, so that the whole room would understand the joke. The clerk laughed first. 14 acres of fruit even the pigs would not touch, offered as payment for 16 years of labor and 40 pounds of unpaid wages. Beatrice Cole, 32, picked the apple up and bit into it. The bitterness pulled her jaw tight, but the flesh was firm and clean, and she had spent her whole life learning what sound fruit felt like against the tooth. She had no cash, no horse, no cart, and nothing left of her father but a grafting knife with a worn ash handle. She signed anyway, because what Edmund Vane did not know was that on the press house wall at Bramble End, above 3 hollowed sorting bays, waited the answer that would change what she was worth, and what the whole valley pressed. If anyone ever handed you a joke and called it wages, tell me about it in the comments. Her father used to say that fruit tells the truth about a tree long before the tree does, and that saying had earned him 40 years of steady work and a grave with no stone over it. Samuel Cole had run the press days at the Tarrington estate for most of his life, and the cider that came out of those days once took a silver medal at the Hereford show. The printed card under the medal named the estate and the squire. His name went into the wage book at 9 shillings a week and nowhere else. He taught his daughter the rose the way other men taught their sons a trade, tree by tree, season by season, and on the morning she first walked to the hiring fair at 16, he ground his grafting knife fresh on the doorstep and handed it to her. "Keep the edge clean, and put your name to your work," he said. He had been dead 9 years now. The press house at Bramble End was locked the same winter he was buried, because no man left on the estate knew how to run a big pressing without him, and it had stayed locked ever since. Beatrice had gone on pruning and sorting and grafting for day wages, and the wages had come late, and short, and then not at all. Which was how she came to be sitting in the estate office at Tarrington on a wet morning in September of 1881, across a table from her cousin. Edmund Vane was 39, steward of the estate, a careful man in a good coat, and he owed her 40 pounds in unpaid wages, along with her dead mother's small interest in the family land. Beside him sat Mr. Loder, a solicitor from Ledbury, 61, who kept his ink in a brass, traveling well, and wiped his pen between every signature as though the pen belonged to somebody stricter than himself. "There is no cash in the estate this year," Edmund said. "There is land. I am offering you Bramble End entire. 14 acres, some 260 standing trees, the press house, and everything fixed inside it. Most men would call that generous." He turned the apple on the deed with one finger. "Even the pigs leave this fruit lying in the grass, cousin. I want that understood before you sign, so that nobody says I hid anything from you." Loder read the schedule aloud in a flat voice. The orchard, the press house, the mill, stone, press, and gear fixed there too, and free and accustomed way along the lane for carts at all usual times. Beatrice listened with the sour taste of the apple still on her tongue, and while Loder read, she turned over the old inventory sheet that came with the deed. Someone long ago had sketched the upper floor of the press house on it, and beside the 3 fruit bays that someone had drawn 3 small marks, repeated in columns, a ring, a cross, a stroke shaped like a leaf. She looked at the marks for a while. "These apples were never meant to stand alone," she said. "They were never meant to be eaten either," Edmund said. "That is rather the trouble with them." The clerk laughed again, softer this time. Beatrice signed her name, took the deed, and put the apple core in her apron pocket, because the seeds were plump and she wasted nothing. She knew exactly what the settlement was. 40 pounds owed, paid off with ground her cousin believed worthless, so that no coin would ever leave the estate box. A wage settlement would have melted in a winter of rent and bread. Ground was different. Ground could be worked, but walking home in the rain she kept turning one question over. The way you turn a coin you suspect is false. Nobody builds a 2-story press house with a horse mill and 3 sorting bays to serve fruit that cannot be drunk. A building like that gets built for a reason, and the reason had been worth money to somebody once. She walked out to Bramble End the next morning, 2 miles of hedged lanes with the red Herefordshire earth showing through the wet grass, the church bell at Tarrington counting 8 somewhere behind her. The orchard lay on a low slope facing southwest, bounded by hawthorn grown ragged as an old dog, with a small watercourse along the bottom end. The grass stood to her knees between the rows. Dead branches hung split and gray in the crowns. Root suckers came up thick around the trunks like beggars around a door. She went down the rows the way her father had taught her, not looking at the orchard but asking it questions. She pressed her thumbnail into the bark of a dozen trunks and found live green under every one. She bent shoots and felt them spring back instead of snapping dry. She pulled fruit from different rows and bit into each one and spat and paid attention. The trees along the top rows carried small, hard apples so sharp they flooded her whole mouth. The middle rows carried fruit that dried her tongue like strong tea and left a bitter grip at the back of her throat. Not one apple she opened was rotten on the tree. The fruit was small and ugly and hostile, and it was sound, and the rows were planted in blocks, sort by sort, which meant somebody had chosen every tree on purpose. The drainage was another story. The ditch along the lower rows had silted level with the ground, and water stood in sheets among the last 3 rows, and the little brook was choked with alder and dead leaves. Wet feet rot an apple tree slowly, the way debt rots a family. That could be dug out. Digging cost nothing but her back. The press house stood in its yard with its faded red tiles streaked dark where the rain got through. She put her shoulder to the swollen door. Inside, on the ground floor, the circular stone chase was gritty with pumice dried to black crumbs 9 years old. The runner stone itself, the great wheel of stone the horse drags around the chase to crush the fruit, rang true when she knocked it. No cracks. The wooden sweep the horse pulls was warped like a bow. The iron screws of the press turned stiff under ancient grease, but they turned. The press bed sagged at one corner. The drainage channel in the floor was blocked solid. Of the casks along the wall, 3 were stove in, 2 smelled dead, and one corner of the room held the sharp vinegar smell every cider maker learns to hate. Up the ladder, the loft told her more. 3 wide sorting bays were built along the wall, boards worn hollow by years of fruit. The middle bay was stained brown-black deep into the grain. The west bay had its thresholds scuffed broad and pale, as though the heaviest baskets had always come through there. Above them hung an old tally board, and on it, faded almost to nothing, were the same 3 marks as the inventory sketch. A ring, a cross, a leaf, chalked in columns, over and over, with counts beside them. She was still standing under the leak in the roof when a boy came up the lane with a folded note. Edmund's hand, small and even. The estate's carts and horses were estate property and were not included in the settlement, and she should make her own arrangements for haulage. She read it twice and put it in her pocket with the apple seeds. Her father had stood in this room. She could remember him on the big press days, in lantern light, forearms wet with juice to the elbow, calling the layers of the cheese as they built it. Men twice his wage obeying his voice. Everything he knew went into the estate's cider and the estate's name, and when he died, the knowledge was buried in the same box, and the door was locked. She stood where he had stood, and felt the old fear move in her, the fear that whatever she built here would end the same way, with her knowledge in somebody else's bottle and her name in a wage book. So ask yourself the question Beatrice was asking under that leaking roof. Why would anyone build a 2-story press house, with a horse mill and 3 sorting bays and a stone big enough to grind the fruit of half a parish, to serve 14 acres of apples that nobody on earth could drink? She walked past the answer twice that afternoon. It was chalked in 3 faded marks above her head, and it would take her 1 ruined batch, 1 rejected sale, and the worst winter of her life to learn to read it. That night she counted her money at the kitchen table of the cottage she rented by the quarter. £3, 11 shillings, and 4 pence, kept in a tobacco tin. She counted it twice, wrote the sum in pencil on the flyleaf of an old receipt book, and under it she wrote 3 words: roof, press, drainage. She could not afford all 3. She sat with the candle until it guttered, and then she crossed out the roof. Jonah Pike came out on the Thursday. He was 47, a wheelwright and carpenter from Tarrington, a wide man who touched wood the way a farrier touches a horse, and he walked the machinery for an hour before he named a price. A new sweep of seasoned ash and a new guide, 7 shillings and 6 pence. The press bed relayed in sound oak, £1 and 2 shillings. The roof made good, 30 shillings even using the old tiles. And I will want it staged, he said. Half before I cut wood. No offense meant, but this place has owed men money before. She paid him half on the sweep and nothing else. The roof she patched herself over the middle bay with tiles carried up from a fallen buyer, and the drain she dug herself, evenings, in the rain. On the Friday a girl was waiting at the orchard gate, 18, thin as a hop pole, with her sleeves already rolled. Clara Finch had lost her seasonal place at the estate at Michaelmas. Her father was a lengthman who kept the Ledbury Road, and there were 5 children younger than her in a 2-room cottage, and none of that was Beatrice's business. and Clara told her all of it anyway in under a minute. "I cannot promise you regular wages," Beatrice said. "2 days a week, 8 pence a day, paid Saturday. If there is nothing to pay you with, I will tell you to your face and you can leave." Clara said that was fair, and came the next morning an hour early. The mill nearly beat them before they started. Jonah hung the new sweep, harnessed his own cob to it, and the runner stone ground round the chase for a quarter turn, and then rode up and out of the track, screeching against the rim. Jonah wanted to dress the stone, swearing it had worn crooked, which would cost days and money. Beatrice crouched by the axle through 2 slow circuits, and watched what the wood did. "The stone is true," she said. "Your new sweep is fighting the old guidepost. The post is worn oval, the beam lifts, the stone leans out. Change the post and leave the stone alone." Jonah measured the post with his calipers, was quiet for a moment, and changed the post. That afternoon the stone went round the chase full circle, smooth as a mill wheel, and then round again, and the low rumble of it rolled out of the open door and down the lane for the first time in 9 years. Sarah Wall, who kept the bread oven at the crossroads and was 60 years old, left a loaf and a jar of dripping on the press-house step that evening, and would not take a penny, so Beatrice sent Clara after her with a bundle of dry apple wood for the oven, because debts were debts. Edmund came past on his grey mare while the stone was still turning. He stopped at the gate. He watched one full circuit of the mill, and his face did not move, and he said nothing at all, and he rode on toward Tarrington a little faster than he had come. Harvest came in the 2nd week of October, and it taught Clara more in 3 days than school had taught her in 8 years. Beatrice showed her on the grass, apple by apple, the difference that would make or break everything to come. A windfall with a bruise on one cheek was working fruit, good for the mill within the week. An apple with a brown collapsed patch, or a wasp hole, or that soft giving feel like a sleeping cheek, went on the discard heap. No argument, no exceptions. "Smell them," Beatrice said, cutting one of each open on her knee. "That one smells of apple. That one smells of what it is turning into. One rotten apple presses its rot into the whole cheese, and you cannot press it out again." On the 4th day, Clara brought in 6 baskets in the time most pickers managed 4, and at the bottom of 2 of them lay windfalls gone brown to the core. She had been picking for speed, sweeping up everything under the trees the way the estate gangs did for the pigs. Beatrice tipped all 6 baskets out on the grass and made her sort every apple again, and sorted beside her, saying the reasons out loud instead of the blame, until the light went. It cost them a full afternoon. It was cheaper than a spoiled cask. The later ripening fruit from the top rows went into tumps, low heaps built on straw in the orchard and covered over with straw and old sacking, where hard fruit could lie 2 or 3 weeks and sweat and mellow before milling. While they were building the second tump, Margaret Priest drove her cob and cart up the lane. Margaret was 55, widowed, a smallholder from beyond the brook with a loft full of sweet apples and no press worth the name since her husband died. She looked at the tumps, and at the swept chase through the open door, and made her offer with no ribbon on it. 2 cartloads of her sweet fruit, in exchange for pressing when Beatrice's mill was running, and a share of the finished drink. "I am not taking in other people's fruit," Beatrice said. "Not this year. This ground has been called worthless in front of a solicitor, and I mean to show what it can do by itself." "By itself," Margaret said, and clicked her tongue at the cob, and turned the cart in the gateway and left. She did not argue. Careful people rarely do. The first milling day came cold and bright. Jonah's cob went round the chase from 8 in the morning, the runner stone growling over the fruit, and the smell of crushed apples rose up through the building and out over the yard, sharp enough to sting. The crushed pulp, the pomace, came off the chase like wet brown wool, and Beatrice let it stand overnight in the troughs, another of her father's habits, for the color and the body it gave. Next morning they built the cheese. A square of strong horsehair cloth, the hairs, laid on the press bed, pomace spread thick across it. The cloth folded over. Another hair, another layer of pomace, another fold, until the stack stood as high as Clara's shoulder, 8 layers, square and true as brickwork. Then the iron screws, turned in slow half-circles, one side and then the other, even as a prayer. The cheese creaked. The first juice came out of it in threads, then in streams the color of dark honey, running along the channels of the press bed into the wooden trough. Beatrice caught some in her palm and tasted. Strong, sharp enough to make her eyes water, with that gripping dryness underneath, and sweetness buried somewhere in the middle of it. Young juice always promises more than it means, but this juice was full of fight, and fight was what fermentation wanted. The juice went into the 2 sound casks, scalded clean, bungs left open, and within days the wild yeast took hold, and the froth worked up and out of the bung holes and down the staves, carrying the dirt of the juice with it, and the press house smelled like a living place. Beatrice topped the casks as the froth fell back and marked each one with chalk. She stood in the doorway that evening with her shoulders aching and allowed herself 1 whole minute of believing she had answered Edmund's joke already. By late November, the first hard ferment was done, and the young cider had settled bright enough to judge. She spent the waiting weeks on the drain, on pruning dead wood out of the best rows, and on the accounts in the receipt book, which said, in pencil, that she had £1 and 6 shillings left between herself and the winter. On the last Tuesday of November, she paid 6pence for the carrier's cart to Hereford and carried a stone jar of the young cider wrapped in sacking on her knees the whole way. Arthur Bellamy was 46, a drink merchant off Widemarsh Street who supplied several inns, a man with cellar-colored skin and a ledger for a heart, and he was the only buyer within reach, whose word moved orders. He took the jar, held a glass of it to the window light, smelled it, and drank without hurry. "It is clean," he said at last. "Well made. Whoever pressed this knew the work. I would tell any man so." "Then you will take it," Beatrice said. "I will not." He set the glass down. "Drink it and listen to your own mouth. It comes in hard, and there is nothing in the middle of it, and it goes out harder. It is all bones and no meat. My trade is the second cup, Mistress Cole. A landlord fills a man's first cup on my say-so, and the man himself orders the second. Nobody orders a second cup of this. Bring me something a man can sit inside of an evening, and I will taste it again." He was not unkind about it. That made it worse. She rode the carrier home with the jar between her boots, and by Saturday it was around Tarrington Market that the Cole woman's cider had been sent back from Hereford, and Edmund told a knot of growers, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that he could have saved her the 6pence. "The fruit is the fruit," he said. "You may polish a crab all winter. It is still a crab." Beatrice heard it from Clara, who had heard it from Sarah Wall, and she wrote nothing in the receipt book that night. She sat with the deed, and the old inventory sheet spread on the table instead, and stared at the 3 little marks until the candle burned down. The fruit was sound. She would have staked her tongue on it in any company. The milling was right, the cheese was right, the ferment had run clean. Every piece of the work was correct, and the drink was still wrong, and that left only one question standing. If the fruit was good, and the work was good, what had this orchard actually been for? Her first answer was time. Hard late fruit mellows in the tump, so perhaps the fault was hurry, and the apples had wanted longer to sweat before the stone. In December she tried it properly. The last tump from the top rows had lain under straw a full 3 weeks, and she milled it as a small trial on its own. 1 cheese, 1 clean half cask, everything else the same. She wrote the particulars in the receipt book, date, rows, days in the tump, because if she was going to be wrong, she intended to know exactly how. The trial came off the press smelling rounder, and when it had worked through its first ferment, the edge of it had softened a little. She could not deny that. She could not pretend it was mended either. The middle of the drink was still hollow, and the finish still scoured the tongue like a yard broom. She wrote 1 line under the particulars. Longer sweating, better nose, same hole in the middle. It was a real answer. It was just an answer to the wrong question. She was returning a borrowed coil of rope to Margaret Priest 2 days later, because owing things made her itch, when the second clue walked up to her in a kitchen apron. Margaret poured tea she did not offer twice, and looked at her over the cup. "You pressed alone, I hear. Your father never did that, you know. Not with Bramble End fruit." "He pressed at Bramble End 30 years, Beatrice said. "He pressed at Bramble End with half the parish in the yard," Margaret said. "I carted to those pressings as a young wife. He would set his own fruit ready, and then he would wait. 2 days, 3 days, however long it took, until the carts came in from Longmoor and from my husband's ground. Big days. 3 fires going and the horse changed at noon. He never once started the screws until all 3 lots were in the loft. I never asked him why. It was his trade, not mine." Beatrice walked home the long way, through the orchard, and climbed to the loft, and stood in front of the 3 bays in the grey afternoon light, with her heart going quicker than the latter could explain. She had read the tally board from the first day as a record of dates, early and middle and late pickings. Now she read it like a wage book. The ring column carried the biggest counts, year after year. The leaf column came second. The cross column was always the smallest, and it was never empty. 3 marks. 3 sources. Ring for the sweet fruit carted in from Longmoor. Cross for the sharp fruit off the priest's ground. Leaf for Bramble End's own bitter hard apples, filling their own bay in their own house. The stained middle bay had held her orchard's tannic fruit until the boards drank the color. The scuffed west bay had taken the heavy incoming loads. The board was a recipe written in freight, and there was more. Once she knew what she was looking at. Down the rows nearest the brook she found old graft scars, a hand above the ground, the bark changing texture above the knuckle where a chosen sort had been set onto rootstock 40 years back. Old Davy Prosser, 71, who had plowed for her father and now walked out most Sundays for no reason he ever gave, stood at the gate that week, looked down the rows for a long while, said the trees had gone in the year of his wedding, and went away again. Planted all of an age, grafted to chosen sorts, set out in blocks. Nothing about Bramble End was an accident except its ruin. What she did not have was proportions. A tally of cartloads is not a measure of juice, and her father's measures had gone into the ground with him. She knew now that the drink wanted 3 voices. She did not know how loud each voice should sing, and there was only one honest way to find out. She went back across the brook the next morning and stood in Margaret's yard and said the thing that cost her most that whole winter. "I was wrong to turn your fruit away. I would like your 2 cartloads. And your carting, when the mill runs. In exchange, I will press whatever you send me this season, and 1 gallon of every 5 of the finished drink is yours. I will put it in writing." "You will put it in writing," Margaret agreed, "because I am careful and you are proud, and paper is good for both conditions." The trials took 9 days, and Beatrice ran them like a woman conducting an examination. She scalded 2 half-tubs and a row of stone jars with water off the fire and let them steam dry. She pressed each fruit separate, Bramble End bitter apples in 1 small cheese, Margaret's sweet keepers in another, and a barrow of rough, sharp apples out of Margaret's hedgerow in a third. She measured with the same 2-gallon bucket every time, level to the brim, no guessing, and she mixed juice to juice in the jars by measure, and chalked a letter on every jar, and wrote every blend in the penny memorandum book she bought for the purpose. Date, measures, fruit, and later, in a column of its own, what her mouth found. Jar A, 1 measure of bitter to 4 of sweet, drank soft and friendly and then fell flat and died before the swallow was done. Jar B, even halves, was cleaner than her single orchard pressing but still rasped going down, still too much fence rail in it. Jar C carried 2 measures of sweet, 1 of bitter, and half a measure of sharp, and when she came back to it after its working and drew the first glass, the smell rose up to meet her before the glass reached her chin. It filled the middle of the mouth the way Bellamy had asked for. The bitter fruit stood underneath the sweetness like joists under a floor, and the sharp cut the whole thing clean at the end, and the end of 1 mouthful asked plainly for the next. She sat down on an upturned bucket and laughed once, short, at the size of the thing she had nearly missed. Then she tasted C again beside A and B to be sure her mouth was not flattering her, and wrote all 3 verdicts down, and added a line she underscored twice. The blend follows the fruit. Taste first, then set the measures. Every load different, every year different. No rule but the tongue and the book. Margaret came for her share of news that evening, tried jar C without ceremony, and set the glass down. "That is your father's drink," she said, "near enough to make a body's eyes sting any road, and you may note, since you keep that book of yours, that it took my fruit and your fruit to make it. You bolt that door of yours like the parish means to rob you, Beatrice. Keeping hold of a thing and doing every hand's turn of it alone are 2 different things. Your father commanded 40 souls on a press day, and there was never one of them in doubt about whose pressing it was." "I am learning it," Beatrice said, "slower than I would like." "You are learning it at 32, Margaret said. "I learned it at 50, when my husband died and I found out how much of the farm had been him. You are ahead." She laid it all out for herself that night the way a joiner lays out his stock before he cuts. Her own tongue, trained since childhood on sweetness, sharpness, and that dry gripping bitterness. The 3 bays, worn each in its own way by its own fruit. The tally board, counting cartloads from 3 sources, year after profitable year. The graft scars on chosen rootstocks, set out in blocks by a planter who knew exactly what he wanted from every row. Margaret's memory of the loaded carts her father waited for, and 9 days of measured jars saying the same thing in plain figures. Bramble End had never been a failed eating orchard. It had been planted deliberately, tree by grafted tree, to grow the backbone of a blended cider. The bitterness that puckered Edmund's clerk was tannin, the same dry grip you taste in strong tea, and in a finished cider, it is the difference between a drink with body that keeps sound from one harvest to the next, and a thin sweet wash that spoils by summer. The sharpness that flooded the mouth was the acid that keeps the drink clean and alive. The sweet fruit, the only sort Edmund knew how to value, gave strength and roundness and nothing else, and by itself it made cider as dull as by itself Bramble End made cider harsh. 3 grounds, each growing one voice well, had once met in this one press house because the backbone fruit and the machinery lived together, and the man who conducted the meeting had been paid 9 shillings a week for it. Edmund had weighed the orchard by setting 1 apple on a deed and watching people's faces. He had valued the bone by asking whether anyone would care to eat it. Very well. She knew now what she owned, and what she owned was worth nothing alone, and that was the entire point of it. The plan went into the memorandum book in pencil over 2 evenings, in columns, costed. She would open the press house to the neighboring holdings that had no working press within 5 miles. She would take her toll the old way, in kind, 1 gallon in 6 of the drink, or its worth in delivered fruit, agreed on paper before a single apple crossed the threshold. Every load would be entered by source, day, and condition, and assigned its bay. The blending would be hers alone, done by taste and by measure and written down, and the finished cider would sell under her own name, and the figure at the bottom of the columns said that if she could press and sell 45 hogsheads, the big 54-gallon casks, she would clear her debts and hold the ground with money to spare. Word moves fast where money might be. On the next market day at Tarrington, William Tandy, a grower of 38 with more sharp fruit than sense of what to do with it, stopped Edmund Vane by the Corn Exchange and asked him, civil as Sunday, whether the lane past the estate would be clear for carts come the new year, as a number of them were thinking of pressing at Bramble End on shares. Edmund said the lane was estate business, and walked on, and thought about very little else for a fortnight. The press house filled with work the way a dry ditch fills in rain. Jonah relaid the press bed in seasoned oak for his £1 2 shillings, half down, and made the roof over the bays sound with the reclaimed tiles, and stopped doubting out loud, which from Jonah was applause. Beatrice bought 6 sound hogsheads on credit from Rees, the cooper at Ledbury, a heavy deliberate man of 60, payment due the last day of March, and that date went into the book in ink. Every cask was scalded, drained, and smelled before it was passed. One of the 6 came up sour under the steam, and she broke it up for firewood in the yard where everyone could watch her do it, though it had cost her credit she did not have. A cask keeps the sins of its past. She would not sell drink out of a sinner. Clara brought in 5 women off the winter parish rolls, seasonal workers like herself, and ran them with a slate by the door. Every woman chalked her hours under Clara's eye, every load was entered in the intake book, source, date, condition, bay, and every Saturday the wages were counted out in coin on the press bed at noon, exact, in front of witnesses. The week the money ran short for the carrier, Beatrice walked the 8 miles to Ledbury and back rather than touch the wage column. That also was watched and noted and worth more than it cost. The fruit came in. Margaret's sweet keepers, Tandy's sharps, 2 smaller loads of sweets from the Alden brothers who farmed under the estate's shadow and came anyway. With the fruit came the troubles any working yard breeds. In the second week, the near screw of the press seized halfway down a cheese. Grit worked into the old threads, and the whole stack stood weeping juice while they drew the screw, cleaned the thread with tallow, and Jonah filed off a burr by lantern light. 2 hours gone and the women standing cold. In the third week, 2 of the women fell out over the slate, one swearing she had chalked a day the board did not show, and Beatrice settled it by paying the disputed 8 pence out of her own pocket once, in front of everyone, and ruling that no chalk went up or came down without Clara's initials. And when Tandy's second load came in with rot swimming at the bottom of the sacks, she turned half the load back on the cart in the man's own presence, short of sharp fruit as she was. Sound fruit or no fruit, she said. That is the price of my name on the cask. Tandy went off swearing, and came back 4 days later with clean fruit, because there was no other press within 5 miles, and because his wife had tasted jar C. By late January, the first blended pressings were working in their casks, and Beatrice carried a small sample to Hereford wrapped in the same sacking as before. Bellamy drank it, and looked at her a moment longer than he needed. "That is a different animal," he said. "Now hear the rest, and I will have it plain. One good jar buys nothing. I will come out in the spring when it has settled, and I will pick the casks myself, my own choosing, any cask in the house. If they hold together cask to cask, I will talk quantities and delivery like a man of business. If they do not, I will get in my trap and go home. Consistency is the trade, Mistress Cole. Any orchard can be lucky once." She agreed to every word of it, and put the date in the book. Edmund, riding the estate's bounds that same afternoon, sat his mare at the top of the lane and counted 4 laden carts turning in at Bramble End, and understood, with the particular coldness of a man who is good with figures, that the property he had used to bury a debt was on its way to being worth more than the orchards he had kept. February showed her what a careful man does when figures turn against him. The Alden brothers sent word, awkward and roundabout, that their remaining sweet fruit was spoken for after all. They rented 2 of their best fields from the estate, and their lease came up at Lady Day, and nothing more needed saying. Tandy held on, but his loads came half the size and his eyes went everywhere but her face. Then the main cart gate, where the lane to Bramble End crossed a corner of the family land, appeared one morning wearing a new chain and an estate padlock, which put 4 miles of parish road between her yard and everything north of it. And at Tarrington Market Edmund began asking, of nobody in particular and everybody within earshot, whether a family settlement of wages had truly carried away the estate's mill and press, or whether the machinery had been estate goods all along, improperly included. He was too careful to make it an accusation. He made it weather. The sky joined him. 3 days of rain at the end of the month put the brook over its banks. Her own summer digging held the lower ditch, but the culvert that carried the water under the lane was estate work and choked solid, and the backed-up flood came over the low corner of the yard where the last incoming loads stood heaped under sacks. When the water went down, they sorted the heaps apple by apple in the cold, and 2 full cartloads went to Margaret's pigs, mud-forced and split, and not to be trusted. And Beatrice stood over the discard pile and made herself count it out loud so the loss would be a figure and not a mood. The worst of it she found alone, on the first morning of March, before anyone else was in. A thin, sharp prick in the air by the cask rose, faint as a pin. She went along the casks smelling until she came to number 12, and there it was, vinegar, unmistakable as a slap. She stood very still, and then she looked for the cause with the lid of her temper held down. Number 12 had been racked in January, drawn off its settled lees into a clean cask, and in the crush of the flood week, she had left it filled a hand's breadth short of the bung and never come back to top it. The air in that gap had done what air always does to young cider. There was a gray skin across the surface, quietly turning her work sour, and no one had done it to her. She had done it to herself, in her own hand, in her own book, where the topping up she had meant to do was written nowhere. Edmund had the news within the week, because casual labor talks, and he improved it in the telling. At market it became the whole batch. Turned, the lot of it, as any man of experience could have foretold, and a mercy if nobody was poisoned. A dealer repeated it within hearing of Bellamy's carter, which was the intention, and Bellamy sent out a note in a clerk's hand, saying only that he would judge what was in the casks when he stood in front of the casks, at the inspection at the end of April, and not sooner. She sat that night at the table with the tin, the receipt book, and the memorandum book, and set the whole position down in figures. The cooper due in ink on the last of March, £1.16 still owing. Jonah's balance, 11 shillings. 6 women's wages against a yard half stopped by a chained gate. 1 cask of 43 gone sour by her own neglect, and the buyer's market talking spoilage. Under all of it she wrote what Edmund had offered her that afternoon, standing in her yard in his good coat, reasonable as arithmetic. £15 to take the whole property back off her hands, before the debts ate her, said kindly, which was the coldest part. £15 was a real sum. It would clear every figure on the page and leave her exactly where she had started. A wage woman with a knife. She looked at the page a long time, and the voice she kept hearing was Margaret's, in her kitchen. Doing every hand's turn alone and keeping hold of a thing are 2 different things. She had been treating every open hand in the parish as a thief's hand, and the only person who had actually cost her a cask of cider that winter was herself. Next morning she called the women in off the yard, stood by cask 12, and told them plainly what it was, how it had happened, and whose fault it was, before rumor could tell them worse. Then they rolled it out into the daylight together and broke it down for the vinegar barrel, and she went along every remaining cask with Clara at her elbow writing, smelling each one, tasting where the spile allowed, chalking the date on every head. From that day, every cask was topped from a jug kept ready on the stand, every week, entered in the book with initials, no exceptions. Then she went asking for help with both hands open, specific help, priced and honest. Margaret's cob and cart, 2 days a week through April, paid in cider at the agreed share. Jonah's 11 shillings to wait until May, in exchange for first call on a hogshead at trade price, which he took, being a man who trusted figures over feelings. Tandy's carting after dark by the parish road, his toll paid back in drink, and a letter to Mr. Loader at Ledbury, with a shilling for his trouble, asking him to bring the deed and the schedule to Bramble End on inspection day, and to read them aloud to whoever needed reading. Bellamy came out on the last Tuesday of April in his black trap, and brought 2 buyers with him, Mr. Kent, who kept the Falcon in Hereford, and Mr. Rees of the Green Man at Ledbury, both men who bought by the year and complained by the week. The yard was swept. The casks stood ranged in their rows, every head chalked with its number and dates, and the intake book and the blending book lay open on a barrel head in the spring light. The chain, it should be said, was already off the gate. Loader's letter to the estate, sent a week before, had quoted the schedule's line about free and accustomed way for carts at all seasons, and had wondered, in one polished sentence, whether the estate wished to argue that line at the county court at its own expense. The estate had not. Edmund arrived anyway on the grey mare, as the first cask was being tapped. He was civil. He was always civil. He hoped the gentleman had not been brought out from Hereford on a fool's errand, since it was known in the parish that the batch had turned, and known too that there was doubt over the title to the very machinery that had pressed it. Beatrice did not raise her voice. She turned the blending book around on the barrel head so that all of them could read it. One cask turned. Number 12, racked short in January by my own neglect, found on the 1st of March, rolled out and broken down the same morning in front of my whole yard. There is the entry, in my hand dated. There is the empty stand. As for the title, Mr. Loader has the deed in his bag, and I paid him a shilling to read slowly. Loader read the schedule's 2 lines, the mill, stone, press, and gear fixed thereto, and the way for carts at all seasons, in the flattest voice in Herefordshire. Kent looked at Edmund with the mild interest of a landlord watching somebody else's dispute. Bellamy took off his coat and hung it on the press. Now then, he said, I will have number 7, number 19, number 31, and number 40, in that order. Nobody hands me a chosen cask in this house. Number 7 had come off the earliest blending, heavier with Tandy's sharps, and it showed a shade more edge, a young wine sharpness that Rees remarked on and did not dislike. Number 31, pressed late with more of Margaret's keepers, drank rounder and slower. Number 19 came cloudy in the first glass, stirred by the tapping, and the yard went quiet enough to hear the brook while it settled, and cleared, and drank clean. Number 40 was the youngest and tasted of it, but sound, the same build underneath, the same dry finish that swept the mouth and asked for the next. 4 casks, 4 corners of the winter, 1 drink. Kent tried them all twice and did his sums half aloud at so much the hogshead against what he paid a Devon man for worse. 42 saleable. By your book and my nose, Bellamy said at last. I make it the same. 28 shillings the hogshead, part money today. The rest on delivery. Deliveries weekly by your own carts as arranged. That is £58 and 16 shillings, Mistress Cole, and I will say in any room in Hereford that the work is honest. And for next harvest, if the drink holds this standard, I will contract now for 60 hogsheads at 30 shillings. Conditional, terms in writing. There was a small sound around the yard, not quite a cheer. The sound working people make when arithmetic comes out on their side for once. Margaret pledged her whole crop to the press house there in the open, and Tandy after her, louder than he needed to, making up for February. And then Bellamy, folding his spectacles, turned to where Edmund still sat the mare by the gate. You grow good sweet fruit on the estate, sir, and you sell it to a dealer at a dealer's price, which is a waste of a fine hillside. It would do well in this blend. If ever you care to send it here, to this yard, where it will be weighed on this beam, inspected by Mistress Cole, entered in her book, and blended as she judges. That is the only gate that fruit comes through. There is no other. Edmund looked at the ranged casks, and at the open books, and at his cousin standing between them in her leather apron with ink on her fingers. He said good day to the company generally, and turned the mare, and rode back up the lane exactly as slowly as dignity required. Beatrice signed the delivery agreement and the conditional contract at the barrel head, and she wrote the name in full, Beatrice Cole. And Loder wiped his pen and blotted it, and that was the first paper in 9 years to carry her family's knowledge and her family's name on the same line. By October of 1882, the rows stood pruned open to the light, the drain ran clear to the brook, and the carts came in under written agreements. Each load slipped and signed at the gate. The women were back on the slate at 10 pence a day now, and the casks stood scalded and chalked in rows that smelled of nothing but clean oak. Third in the line of carts that Monday morning, behind Margaret's and Tandy's, stood a cart of estate sweet apples with Edmund's Carter on the box, waiting its turn under sacking. And when Clara went through the load and set one basket of bruised fruit back on the tailboard, the carter took it without a word, because those were the rules of the yard, and the yard was where the money was. At the bench by the door, Beatrice had a bundle of scion wood laid out, cut from the best of the sweet sorts, ready against the winter's grafting of the rows she meant to remake. She took out the ash-handled knife and showed Clara the long sloping cut and the little tongue, and how to line up the thin green ring under the bark on both pieces, so the two woods would take and grow as one. Keep the edge clean, she said, and put your name to your work. Clara's first cut ran shallow, and she frowned, and made the second one true. Beatrice bound the practice graft with waxed cloth and set it on the bench between them, and out in the yard the beam scale clinked, and Edmund's apples came through the gate one weighed basket at a time. Beatrice Cole was 33 years old. She had been paid for 16 years of work with 14 acres of bitter apples, a locked press house, and a joke she was meant to swallow, and the first season under her own name had returned her £58 and 16 shillings, with 60 hogsheads promised for the next. Of all the wages anyone had ever offered her, the one meant as an insult was the only one that had grown. If a story like hers sits somewhere in your own family, tell it in the comments, and I will see you at the next one.